Emma was a plus-sized woman. She tightly gripped her ticket, ignoring the stares around her as she stepped onto the plane. She didn't want to attract attention. She didn't want to be judged. She just wanted to get home, sit quietly in her seat, and finish her journey. But the moment she stepped onto the plane, she sensed something was wrong. The flight attendant's forced smile wasn't genuine. It wasn't a hospitality expression, but a look of judgment, scanning her from head to toe. It was as if she didn't like Emma's clothes, her body shape, or the way she walked, as if Emma didn't belong there. Nearby, passengers noticed, but they quickly looked away. Silence. A suffocating silence hanging in the air. Emma took a deep breath. She was used to this. For years, she had seen the looks, the whispered comments, the stares that quickly turned away when eyes met. But this time, it was different. It was clearer, sharper. And what Emma didn't know was that, among the passengers on the plane, someone was watching everything closely. And that person was one of Hollywood's most famous actors. However, after hearing the comments, what he did next would leave everyone breathless. Hey you! If you've watched this far, you definitely love Keanu Reeves, and I see you haven't subscribed yet. By subscribing, you can join us and help spread Keanu Reeves' inspiring life lessons to millions. Emma took a deep breath, clutching her bag tightly as she walked down the plane aisle. The carpeted floor felt soft beneath her feet, but the weight in her chest kept growing. Eyes were on her. Most of the passengers quickly looked away. Some stared longer. A few subtly raised their eyebrows. Others rolled their eyes. It was as if she didn't deserve to be part of this journey. Emma kept her head up. She was used to it, but getting used to it didn't mean it didn't hurt. There was a discomfort inside her. It wasn't just the looks. She opened her phone and checked again. The message she'd been waiting for still hadn't come. Toby, her little companion, the elderly beagle who had been by her side for years, was sick. The vet had promised to send the test results before her flight, but still no news. Her chest tightened. 1,000 worst-case scenarios were racing through her mind, but she couldn't let herself break down in front of everyone. Just then, she heard a sweet but insincere voice. "Sweetheart, is this really your seat?" Emma froze. The words sliced through the air like a sharp knife. She raised her head and looked at the source of the voice. It was the flight attendant, the same woman who had given Emma a cold look at the door. Now, her face held a forced smile, but her eyes told a different story. She glanced at the tablet in her hand, then turned back to Emma. She was waiting, as if she expected Emma to admit she had done something wrong. Emma looked at her boarding pass. Everything was in order. "Yes, 22B," she said, trying to sound as confident as possible. The flight attendant's smile remained fake, but the shadow of satisfaction crossed her eyes. The silence stretched. Everyone was listening. Passengers walking down the aisle slowed their steps. People sitting nearby turned their heads to see what was going on. Emma felt a knot in her stomach, but kept her posture straight. Finally, the flight attendant tilted her head slightly and made a suggestion that seemed pre-planned. "If you want a more comfortable space, we can find a seat that's more suitable for you." Her voice was so sweet that it was obvious this wasn't a real offer of help. "But," she paused, raising her eyebrows slightly. "Of course, there would be a price." The plane fell into a deathly silence. For a moment, no one moved. No one even breathed. Emma's face flushed. This was clearly a tactic of humiliation. The sound of someone swallowing a few seats away echoed. Everyone had noticed. but no one said anything. Then, something else caught Emma's attention. Someone was walking down the aisle. A tall man, simply dressed. His slightly bearded face had a charismatic but humble expression. Keanu Reeves. At first, Emma didn't notice him, but then, his eyes briefly shot a sharp glance at the flight attendant. It was a fleeting moment, so brief it was almost unnoticeable, but it held great meaning. Then, without saying a word, he walked on. Emma took a deep breath. That glance gave her so much courage. "I'm happy with my seat. Thank you," she said, in as calm a tone as she could manage. Without waiting another second, she passed by the flight attendant and sat down. But just as she was about to settle into her seat, the passenger next to her, with a subtle look of discomfort, stood up and silently moved to a different seat. Emma froze. She tried to suppress the anger, the sadness, the shame building inside her. But one thing was clear. This was just the beginning. As Emma made her way down the aisle trying to find her seat, she couldn't escape the uncomfortable stares, no matter how quickly she walked. Some passengers quickly looked away. Others scanned her from head to toe, as if questioning her presence. A man, settled in his seat and typing something on his laptop, briefly glanced up as Emma passed by. His eyes left the screen, and he raised an eyebrow, looking her up and down. He pursed his lips and silently shook his head. Displeasure. It was as if Emma's very existence was a mistake. Emma looked away and continued her path. This wasn't the first time she had experienced something like this, but today it felt heavier. She found her seat. She checked her boarding pass again. 22B, a middle seat in the middle row, right in the center of the aisle. She slid into her seat, trying to make herself as small as possible. But as she sat down, she noticed the man next to her staring. The man's face showed discomfort. A quick, almost imperceptible wrinkle of his nose. But Emma noticed. She always noticed. Then, suddenly, the man straightened himself up. But that brief reaction had already lingered in the air. The man silently got up from his seat. Without saying a word, he walked toward the flight attendant to move to another spot. Emma let out a deep sigh. Again. She straightened her shoulders, fixing her gaze on the small screen in front of her seat. She tried to ignore it, but then, at that moment, someone else cared enough to notice. At the other end of the aisle, Keanu Reeves was quietly watching everything unfold. His eyes briefly met the flight attendant's cold, arrogant glance. That look had just sent an unspoken message to Emma. "You shouldn't be here." But Keanu Reeves' gaze showed no hesitation. Quiet, calm, and determined, he was following every movement. And soon, he would do something that would change the entire course of the flight. The hum of the plane began to fade as the passengers settled into their seats, the atmosphere growing quieter. But for Emma, the silence was suffocating. With the man next to her moving to another seat, the mix of shame and anger inside her intensified. This wasn't the first time this had happened. She could read everything in the looks, the silent steps, the brief yet sharp expressions on people's faces. But this time it wasn't only her who noticed. Keanu Reeves was still silently watching her. But this gaze was different. It wasn't pity. It wasn't compassion. It was awareness. He had seen everything unfold from the beginning, and now he could sense something about to happen. The flight attendant was walking toward Emma's row. Her expression was familiar. A forced smile, eyes filled with an ambiguous judgment. But the judgment was unmistakable. Before Emma could even settle into her seat, the voice was heard. "Sweetheart, I think I need to find a more suitable seat for you." The hidden implication beneath those words felt like a knife cutting through the air. The flight attendant's voice seemed polite and gentle, but Emma knew this wasn't an offer. It was a test. Some passengers in the nearby seats turned their heads, listening intently, but none of them said a word. Emma blinked, clenched her jaw, and took a deep breath. She wasn't going to accept this. "I'm fine with my seat, thank you," she said clearly. But the flight attendant's smile didn't fade. It only grew wider. "Oh, but the passenger next to you wanted more space. This might make you feel a little more comfortable." Now, Emma could clearly read the flight attendant's gaze. "You don't belong here." Emma's heart raced, but she didn't look away. She kept telling herself, "Ignore it. Don't react. Keep going as usual." But this time she wasn't going to continue as usual, because someone had already moved. A voice came from the other end of the aisle, deep, firm, and clear. "I think there's a mistake here." The whole plane fell silent in an instant. As the flight attendant turned her head, Emma and the other passengers looked toward the source of the voice. And there he was. Keanu Reeves, having stood up from his seat, was now looking directly at the flight attendant. Emma took a deep breath and looked into the flight attendant's eyes. The woman's face held a forced smile, but the contempt in her eyes was clear. "If you'd like a more comfortable seat, we can move you to another place. Of course, for an additional fee." Her voice was full of fake politeness, but behind the words was an obvious message. "You don't belong here." Several passengers on the plane, hearing these words, raised their heads and directed their gazes toward Emma. Some immediately looked away, clearly uncomfortable, while others quietly observed as if watching a spectacle. But Emma wasn't going to accept this. Suppressing the familiar feeling of shame that was growing inside her, she stood tall and forced a smile on her face. "I'm fine with my seat, thank you." Her voice didn't tremble, but inside a storm was brewing. The flight attendant paused for a moment, as if she hadn't expected such a response. Then, she tilted her head slightly and walked away with a forced smile. Even her departure felt like a challenge, as if to say, "This isn't over." Emma carefully glanced around. The man sitting next to her wore an expressionless face. He adjusted his glasses and then opened his magazine as though nothing had happened. But just then, her eyes caught another passenger passing by in the aisle. A tall man, his light brown hair slightly tousled, wearing simple but striking clothes. He had a natural charisma amidst the crowd, but made no effort to draw attention to himself. Keanu Reeves. Emma recognized him immediately, but more importantly, she realized that Keanu had noticed what was going on. While he moved forward without a word, his gaze lingered on the flight attendant for a few seconds. For a moment, Keanu tilted his head slightly toward Emma, as if silently saying, "I saw everything." The flight attendant, noticing Keanu's gaze, hesitated for a moment. But then, as though nothing had happened, she continued walking away. Emma was in turmoil. She was still grappling with the sting of the condescending words, but knowing that Keanu had noticed gave her some strength. But this was only the beginning. Because after the plane took off, the flight attendant would return, and this time, things would only get worse. As the plane took off, Emma took a deep breath, trying to suppress the storm raging inside her as she looked out the window. Was it over? No, a feeling deep inside her said this was only the beginning. The man next to her removed his glasses and leaned back in his seat, glancing at Emma as if he was about to say something, but then he decided against it. The other passengers on the plane had returned to their usual, relaxed selves. It seemed like people were just watching, but no one was doing anything. And at that very moment, the voice of the flight attendant was heard again. She was standing at the front of the aisle, pushing the service cart forward, but her eyes were clearly fixed on Emma. Emma took a deep breath and braced herself. This woman wasn't going to back off. As the flight attendant approached, she put on her fake smile and spoke. "Oh, sweetheart, here's your special order." The entire plane fell silent. Emma hadn't ordered anything. For a moment, Emma didn't understand what she meant. But then, she noticed the sly expression on the flight attendant's face. This was a game. On the tray she was holding, there was an extra meal. Even the man sitting next to Emma raised his eyebrows and looked at her. A few passengers started whispering to each other quietly. The flight attendant seemed to enjoy Emma's confusion, raising her voice slightly. "An extra portion, specially prepared for you. I'm sure you could use it." And at that moment, Emma's face flushed. The stomach churning, accumulated shame over the years tightened in her throat. All the passengers' eyes were on her. No one said anything, but everyone heard it. Everyone saw it. The man next to her stiffened, adjusted his glasses, and opened his mouth, but Emma spoke before him. "I didn't order an extra meal." Her voice was calm but firm. She knew she had to defend herself. The look of contempt on the flight attendant's face shifted slightly. But then, with a mocking smile, she pushed the tray a little closer to Emma. "But sweetheart, it looks like you need it." And then, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. A few passengers' eyes widened. Did she really say that? Some turned their heads away. Some reached for their phones. A few giggled, but most just silently watched the scene unfold. The flight attendant looked at Emma with a victorious expression. "Now, you'll feel small." But someone broke the silence. Someone sitting at the front of the plane unbuckled their seatbelt and stood up. With heavy steps, they walked down the aisle. The flight attendant didn't notice at first, but then she heard that familiar voice. "This is completely unnecessary." The entire plane froze. The flight attendant suddenly held her breath, her eyes widening, because standing in front of her was Keanu Reeves. In that moment, an invisible electricity spread throughout the plane. People looked up. Some reached for their phones. Keanu Reeves was looking directly into the flight attendant's eyes. And now, everything had changed. The plane was silent. A silence so thick that even the low hum of the engines filled the ears. No one moved. Keanu Reeves stood directly in front of the flight attendant. His gaze was calm, but there was a heaviness within it. The flight attendant quickly looked away. She tried to mumble an explanation, but her voice was trembling. "Mr. Reeves, I was just—" But Keanu Reeves didn't even give her the chance to speak. "Just what were you doing?" he asked, his voice low but clear enough for everyone on the plane to hear. The flight attendant opened and closed her mouth a few times, but no words came out. What could she say? Keanu Reeves tilted his head slightly and turned to Emma. In his eyes, there was neither pity nor contempt, only pure, silent support. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, yet carrying deep sincerity. Emma tried with all her might to pull herself together. A part of her wanted to say, "Yes, I'm fine," but she knew that wasn't true. She forced herself to swallow the lump in her throat and simply nodded. But Keanu knew that wasn't enough. The flight attendant noticed the passengers pulling out their phones. Some were recording. This whole moment was being captured. This realization made her mask fall away. "Mr. Reeves, you misunderstand. I was just trying to offer the best service to our passengers," she said, trying to explain. Keanu Reeves looked at her, holding a long, silent gaze. Then, he slightly shook his head and spoke one word. "No." That single word carried a weight that everyone on the plane felt deep in their bones. "This is not service. This is disrespect," he said, his voice still calm, but the firmness behind it was unmistakable. The flight attendant opened her mouth to respond, but just then, an announcement came through the intercom. Ding! "Would a member of the flight crew please come to the front?" Another flight attendant hurried toward the front. She was tense, clearly having received a directive from above. "What's the issue?" she asked, but her eyes were already fixed on the flight attendant. Keanu Reeves took a deep breath and spoke calmly. "I think some boundaries have been crossed here." All the passengers on the plane now had their eyes on the flight attendant. There was nothing left to hide. But Keanu Reeves didn't stop there. He turned toward the aisle, his eyes locking directly on Emma's. And then, with a sentence that silenced the entire plane, he said, "I think there's been a mistake. She doesn't belong here." The flight attendant's face suddenly relaxed, as if Keanu was finally supporting her. But then, Keanu quietly stepped back and continued, "I think she belongs in first class." The flight attendant's fake smile froze immediately. The whole plane paused for a second, then a quiet murmur spread through the passengers. The man sitting next to Emma even straightened up and adjusted his glasses. No one had expected this. Emma was stunned. First class? Her eyes widened, unable to form words. She wanted to say something, but no sound came out. But Keanu Reeves had already made the decision. He leaned forward, his smile genuine, but still carrying a serious tone. "This seat is now yours. Let's go." The flight attendant's face turned pale. This couldn't be happening. But it had happened. The flight attendant opened her mouth to say something, but the words got caught in her throat. She didn't know what to do in front of the scene unfolding before her. Keanu Reeves turned to Emma and slightly tilted his head once again. His eyes seemed to say, "You belong here." The entire plane held its breath. No one moved. All eyes were on either Keanu or Emma. For a moment, Emma felt as though she were dreaming. Was this real? Her heart raced uncontrollably. Could she accept this? On one side, the flight attendant who had humiliated her. On the other side, Keanu Reeves standing up for her. Her own voice sounded foreign to her. "Should I really go?" A small smile appeared on Keanu's lips, but his voice remained calm. "Yes." At that moment, a voice came through the flight attendant's earpiece. A directive had come from above. "Clear a seat in first class." The entire plane watched, stunned. No one had expected such a dramatic turn of events. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, but Keanu's gaze left her no room for doubt. She took a quick breath and turned to Emma with a forced politeness. "Please, let me escort you to first class." But Keanu Reeves shook his head. "I'll be escorting her, not you," he said, his tone soft but firm, leaving no room for debate. And Emma, for the first time in her life, stood up without hesitation. As she stepped into the aisle, some passengers began to lightly applaud. Some simply watched in silence, but most had expressions of admiration and support. Emma felt as though all the invisible burdens she had carried for years were being left behind. Keanu Reeves walked beside her, and together they headed to first class. And just then, a passenger's phone buzzed. A tweet started to spread. Keanu Reeves supported a woman who was being wronged and gave her his seat in first class. The entire plane witnessed it. When Emma sat down in her new seat, she could hardly believe it. But one thing was certain. This flight would be unforgettable, not just for her, but for the entire world.